out the darkest, and they've distributed all the resources along that line, that corridor. And what's happening now is that they're giving the white society in practice $10,000 to play the Monopoly game. They're giving Asians $8,000 to play the Monopoly game. Hispanics $5,000, Indians $3,000, blacks $500. That means what's happening is that now we lack sufficient resources to play the Monopoly game and win. If we can't buy property. You can't not improve property. And if you land on anybody else's property while you're playing that game, you must either go bankrupt or go to jail. And see, the game that got us locked into, we can't win. Because right now, the white society controls nearly 100% of all the income, all the wealth, all the power, all the privileges, all the corporations, and every damn level of government. And they keep telling my people, why don't you change your conditions? With what? You haven't got the resources to change it. And then they got all these myths about, not in my mind, how did they get all the wealth and how did they get the power? And they got all these little myths to try to justify how they got it. They keep telling us, like Tom Sowell, a very conservative black, I just passed in Detroit, Michigan last week, saying, well, white folks got it because they had a good, strong work ethic. They worked hard. See, nobody worked harder than a slave. The credo of this nation is that if you work hard, you're supposed to progress. And see, that credo has been violated against black folk. And here's Tom Sowell telling me and other people in that community that if, in fact, black folk had a good, strong work ethic, if black folk work hard, as the Japanese and as the Germans models, then they would have progressed too. And I said, that's BS. Let me tell you something. If the white society had felt that the Japanese and the Germans were such good work models, why didn't they go over there and capture them and put them into slavery? Instead of going around criticizing my people about being lazy slaves, you know, why would you spend that much time and energy to go over there and kidnap 35 to 50 million black slaves and bring them back over if they're lazy and can't work? Why don't you go get those Chinese and Japanese and Germans and put them over here in slavery? But see, that makes white folk look dumb. They've spent 400 years trying to deploy, exploit, abuse my people by saying they're lazy slaves. Like, what incentive would I have as a slave to work hard in the first place? What are you going to do if I work hard as a slave? You're going to free me? Yeah. Do I get some kind of early retirement, a pension plan? And a nerve of conservative blacks running around the country saying black folks were lazy slaves. That's what they should have been. Now, I'm serious. Don't get me laughing now. I'm serious. But let me go back and cast how they really got their wealth. You see, because they got all these other games about they're so, you know, anti-government. They want to downgrade government. They want to cut the budget. They want smaller government. That's BS. Now, see, what they think is that somehow black folks are going to be able to use government to get the wealth that they got. See, they didn't get their wealth the old-fashioned way as they claim by working hard. See, up until the 1950s, the worst insult to a white person in this country was to be seen doing hard work by a black man. Now they run around claiming they are the working people. When did they do the work? And let me go back right now through history and tell you where they got their wealth from. See, they got their wealth from three sources. The first, where they got their wealth from black folk as commodities and as a labor-producing machine. That's where they got their first source of wealth from. The second group of wealth came from land that they expropriated from the Indians. And the third source of wealth came from governmental treaties, programs, and policies. That's where they got their three sources of wealth from, okay? Now, back in about the 14th or 15th century, white Europeans were poor, impoverished, and famine-stricken. They had nothing. But they found out by a little exploration that Africa was rich in natural resources. And so the Portuguese and some of the Spanish started going around the coast and picking up on a few of the habits that black chiefs had started at that time, like trading slaves. And since unfortunately some of our people didn't know any better. And some of them still don't know any better. They were enslaving their own people as a sort of a ritual, just to show how much power he had over his people. And as a good diplomatic relationship with anybody that came into the town, they'd say, well, before we trade anything else, you gotta buy one of my slaves. And see, and unfortunately, at that time, a lot of our people in Africa did not see our unity and our togetherness based on color. They based it on tribes. So if you're from a different tribe, therefore I had justification to mistreat you and abuse you as a black person. And we never would have been put into slavery except for three factors. If black folk had not been disorganized in Africa, if we've had general unity, and if in fact we had not been imposed upon by every nationality, every religious denomination, and every government on this earth. Black folk were commercialized like no other group of human beings in the history of this world. So when they went into Africa then, they began to pull blacks out and take their wealth under an arrangement they call a doctrine of unequal exchange, which means I would give you something of less value and take what you got from you. And all of it, and after about 100 years, all of a sudden, so much wealth had been displaced out of Africa that Europe became resuscitated and began to thrive again by the 15th century. And they took all that wealth and began to build up Europe. And they came up with some new concepts, new banking codes, new commercial codes. And they came up with one thing that's very important. They came up with a new concept called capitalism. Capitalism came out of black slavery. The money was being produced in Europe. Then they took all that money and put it in Portugal and Spain and then used it to explore the West. They sent people like Columbus west to try to find new lands and for new gold. They didn't send him here to try and look for religious freedom. He came here looking for wealth and power and money. And they took that off the black backs of the money that had been taken out of Africa. And just in a year between, like in 503, the Catholic Church at that point in time condoned using blacks as slaves all over the world and not to use Indians. And then they shipped between 1500 and 1650, that 150-year period, they shipped over 15 million blacks just to Latin Americans and Mid-America. And during that period of time, they used blacks as mining machinery in Mexico and Peru and Venezuela and Brazil. And just in Mexico alone, in that period of time, blacks dug out over 500 tons of gold and over 16,000 tons of silver. And that made those countries powers to be dealt with on the earth. When they came into the United States, they set up what they call a trading and a treatment center with all blacks coming into the Caribbean. And they set up a premise that every black that was shipped out of Africa into the Caribbean to be treated, which means he was to be trained to go into slavery. They set up a system of making sure that on every black slave that was shipped out of Africa, that they picked up at least a 1,500% return on their investment, which means they were paying something like $25 for every slave kidnapped out of Africa. And they sold him for something like anywhere from $300 to $400 per person they hit this country. Now, by the time the Europeans started coming into the United States, they came here looking for wealth in 1607. And most of them died in the first few years, but they didn't find any wealth. By 1619, the first 20 blacks arrived, and they were sold as indentured servants. And they had relative freedom up until about 1634. 1634, the Maryland colony came into existence. And by now, they found a need to separate blacks out. So in 1638, that was the beginning of racism in this country at that point in time. Because at that time, the Maryland colony put out the first public edict that still dictates what happens to black folk in this country. At that point in time, they said no black in America shall ever enjoy the fruits of white society. And that's the basis of all your racism in this country. So between that point and 1655, the European governments were pressing the pilgrims in this country about finding some wealth, finding some crops, sending something back to Europe for the investment they was making in this country. and they couldn't do it. The letters were going back to Europe saying, we cannot develop America because it would take us a lifetime just to clear the land, the trees, the rocks, the soil, the snakes. We don't have the labor to do it. Poor whites won't do it, and Indians got better sense of doing it. Then it went back at about 1660, they went back to that public edict in 1638, said, we got a group of excluded people here. And so all the colonies by 1665 enacted enslavement laws that says, now let's redefine black folk and put out a national public policy that shall last as long as this country exists. And that policy said that in the future, black folk shall constitute a subordinated, excluded, non-competitive, non-compensated, managed labor force for the personal comfort and wealth building of white society. And that's what you've been under. They have had a national public policy on us for nearly 400 years.